Hey everybody, this is your Digital Super Saiyan 3, back here with another video, and I gotta say, happy anniversary Fullmetal Alchemist. And I'm talking about the original anime, not the manga, because the manga is only 22 years old. I'm talking about the original anime that would come 2 years after the manga's release. So anyway, I wanted to do this video. Since I had just recently rewatched the entire series, I decided to do this video of which episodes of the original Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 series I actually enjoyed. And keep in mind, although I may be a Brotherhood fan, I still to a degree like 2003. I think 2003, when I rewatched it again, I gotta say, I understand the points of view and why people like it so much. And don't get me wrong, I too have my favorite episodes of this show too. So with that being said, let's take a stroll down memory lane. These are my favorite top 10 Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 episodes. Number 10, Episode 13, Flame vs. Full Metal. Okay, so this episode basically adapts a bonus chapter that was in the manga, where Edward takes on Mustang. I mean, the name is called Flame vs. Full Metal. Plus, you also got the side plot of the soldiers trying to find a home with Black Hayate, and Black Hayate ended up being adopted by Riza Hawkeye. Anyway, I love how they managed to make this episode blend into the narrative of 2003 so well. Especially since they add, besides the hijinks that ensue in this episode, like during Edward and Roy's fight, you also get the infamous miniskirt moment from Roy Mustang when he says, on that day, all female officers are required to wear tiny miniskirts. Yes, this is the episode that gave us the infamous Roy Mustang tiny miniskirts moment. Tiny miniskirts! Of course, they also blend in some serious stuff as well. And the reason why Edward is fighting Mustang is, yes, it's part of his yearly assessment as a state alchemist. And he chose Colonel Mustang as an opponent. Oh yes, and as a way of beating Mustang, or as a way of trying to get information out of Mustang on the whereabouts of Dr. Marco, as that's what Edward's whole goal is, and why he's fighting Roy. So anyway, yeah, Episode 13 is a really good episode. It definitely has its serious moments, but also it does have its humor moments too. So on to the next part of the list. Number 9, Episode 50, Death. Okay. If you haven't seen the second to last episode of Fullmetal Alchemist, or if you have, you already know that Edward dies. I'm not freaking kidding. Edward dies fighting against Envy. Okay. Now that I got that out of the way, yes, the name Death says it all. Between this and the last episode, I always gotta say I always like the second to last episode a little bit more than the last episode in general. Don't get me wrong, I think the last episode of Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is fine, but it's not really one of my favorite episodes of the series. Anyway, Death is a really good episode because I love how it starts off in London as Edward tries to make his way back from the other side of the gate. And he and Hohenheim are running through London, which is being bombed by German Zeppelins during World War I. Edward does manage to make it back, although the Edward from the other side of the gate, which housed his soul, had to be sacrificed in order for Edward to return to, well, his world. And then Edward fights against Envy. Meanwhile, while that's going on, Mustang confronts Bradley inside his own wine cellar. Anyway, during the Edward and Envy fight, I love how Envy is just toying with Edward. And yes, Edward cannot use alchemy or risk hurting Alphonse. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. If you didn't see the Lior episodes that happened during the latter half of the series when Edward and Alphonse returned to Lior, Alphonse became a Philosopher's Stone. Or, shall I say, he became the Philosopher's Stone. Whether it being the sacrifice of all the Amestrian soldiers who went to Lior, as well as Scar and all of the people of Ishval that was held within his arm. So, yeah, this episode is just gruesome, especially with the way it ends. Episode 50 is just a really good episode. Number 8. Episode 37, The Flame Alchemist, The Bachelor Lieutenant, and The Mystery. So, yes. It's time we get into an episode that's particularly the funniest episode in the entire 2003 anime. And episode 37 gives us a really good break from the serious stuff we had experienced. Although we do get some serious stuff in this one scene when Mustang visits Hughes' house and he sees Winry in the window, because Winry returned to Central in the previous episode. Anyway, this story revolves around what Mustang and his crew are up to, as Mustang and his company, or his men, are the stars of this episode. So, yes, this is an episode that has no Edward or Alphonse. So, yes, the Elric brothers are absent in this episode. It's mainly about Mustang and his men. It's basically an episode divided into 3 stories. The first one talking about how Mustang's men are investigating what the Colonel does with his free time. The second one is about finding a date for Havoc, where Havoc ends up being sent to the Armstrong Manor about dating Major Armstrong's younger sister, who's exactly like him. And then the third one is about a haunted warehouse known as the infamous Warehouse 13 ghost story. Although it's only 12 warehouses, it's still a really good narrative and a really good episode. Episode 37 just has so many good laughs, and when I watched it again, yeah, this had to be on my favorites list, because it was just that good of a very good time of a hilarious episode. But the next 2 episodes are going to be more serious focused. Number 7, Episode 16, That Which Is Lost. Now, while on their way back to Risenbowl for Edward to get his automail arm repaired, he and Mustang have to stop in a town to, well, retrieve Alphonse, since Alphonse was dumped off at the last stop, mistaken for cargo. And, of course, while that happens, Alphonse's armor, or shall I say, Alphonse is taken by this dumb kid who wanted to use this armor to make his boss happy. Yeah. Now, why did I put this episode on this list? It's mainly what we see about Edward and his mindset going into this, as he's trying to find his brother. And while he's trying to find his brother, he and Armstrong, he chastises Armstrong for what he did in Ishbal. And, of course, Edward meets a disabled soldier at a house at his house. And yes, this disabled soldier lost his leg in Ishbal. And, of course, I love the conversation that he has with Edward. And we see Ed actually see a different point of view of a soldier's mindset that he gets from this guy. Especially since Edward questions, would I have to do the same things he did? I mean, given the fact that, yes, he is a state alchemist and an attack dog for the military. Episode number 6. Episode 22, Created Human. So this is the wrap-up of the 5th laboratory set of episodes. I gotta say the 5th laboratory episodes were fun. I guess they had some good stuff in it. But I gotta say the last episode of the 5th laboratory had to be on here because Edward is this close to making the Philosopher's Stone. Or shall I say, especially since the facility was designed to create the Philosopher's Stone and was saddled next to a prison, mind you. However, the homunculi decide to take Alphonse hostage, and they reveal themselves to Edward. And Edward is left with a choice. Should I sacrifice these death row inmates to make the Philosopher's Stone? Or just so me and my brother could get our bodies back? Or should I let them live? It's a question of what Edward is thinking. This basically has Edward's morality being challenged. And all throughout 2003, Edward's morality is challenged on several occasions. And this is one of them. Should Edward kill these inmates? And is it right to kill these inmates? That is the one question he is facing. But on the end, Scar comes to the rescue, and of course, the Elric brothers do manage to make it out of the 5th laboratory. Alphonse, however, is in pieces, and Edward, on the other hand, well, he's just KO'd. He's knocked out after interacting with red water from the Philosopher's Stone, or to make the Philosopher's Stone. Number 5, episode 26, Her Reason. So, yeah, this is actually a Winry episode. The episode is called Her Reason, and this is about Winry, Edward, and Alphonse both going to Rush Valley. Now, they do go to Rush Valley again in Brotherhood as well, but that was in episode 10 of Brotherhood, and this is about episode 26 of the 2003 series. Now, in 2003, when the brothers and Winry make it to Rush Valley, they stumble upon an automail arm wrestling contest. And yes, Edward does manage to beat the champion by besting him with alchemy. Of course, the dealer who was the champ's personal assistant, mind you, he was using alchemy to cheat, just like how Ed used alchemy to cheat back. Of course, Winry does not take this well after hearing about this, and beats everybody up with a wrench, because this is Winry Rockbell we're talking about. Also, you got Panina, who also makes this episode so great. Now, Panina in the 2003 series is a lot different from her Brotherhood counterpart. Panina in 2003 lost both of her legs and her right arm, and has automail limbs. Of course, Panina in Brotherhood has 2 automail legs, but still keeps her regular arm. Yeah, that's the difference between 2003 Panina and Brotherhood Panina. Anyway, Panina is trying to prove that her automail made by Dominic, her mechanic, who is also her guardian, mind you, is just as good as any mechanic. Is just as good as any mechanics. I mean, as she is trying to prove that Dominic is a good engineer, which he is. But of course, Panina also agrees to help Winry out with trying to teach Edward a lesson. And Edward has to be challenged not to use alchemy to get his pocket watch back from Panina as he is chasing her through the rooftops of Rush Valley. Again, this is a really good episode. Now, it's mainly a good Winry episode in my opinion, and probably my favorite Winry episode. And especially the ending of this episode. Yeah, it also leads into Azumi's introduction into the series, as Azumi makes her debut in this episode. I know, crazy, right? Number 4, Episode 35, Reunion of the Fallen. Now, this episode is centered around lust. As yes, this is a very lust-centric episode. This mainly deals with lust and a young alchemist named Lujan, as Lujan is trying to save his village from a virus that's turning people into rock, that's deconstructing people and making their skin all rock hard. Lujan is looking for a way to create a new Philosopher's Stone, given the fact lust had helped him out previously with curing the virus, but the virus has now returned. Of course, you also have Edward, Alphonse, and Winry coming across a young girl who is Lujan's lover, Elaine or something like that. I forgot her name. Anyway, yeah, if you watch the English dub of this episode, Lujan is voiced by anime veteran Johnny Young Bosch. Yes, that's right. Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 had Johnny Young Bosch in it, so sign me up for that, even though he only appears for one episode. Oh yes, and oddly enough, Lujan also resembles Scar's brother. Yeah. And why Scar's brother... Now, 2003 gives us a good reason why Scar's brother wanted to study alchemy. And yes, he did attempt to use human transmutation by trying to bring back a woman that he loved, who happened to resemble Lust, of course. Anyway, I also love how we get into Lust's head in this episode. Anyway, Lust is probably the best example of character development done right for a villain. But seriously, Lust actually reforms by the end of the series, so Lust becomes sort of a reformed character. But in Brotherhood, no, we don't get that with Lust. Number 3, Episode 49, The Other Side of the Gate. Okay, so now we're approaching the end of the series. The Other Side of the Gate is just a good episode. So, Edward makes it to this temple, which leads him to the underground of Central, where he finds himself in an underground city that was transported underneath what would become Central. Edward also arrives in the villains' base of operations, a giant castle, where he is greeted by Rose. And of course, Lyra, who happens to be the main villain, Dante. Yes. And Dante, throughout 2003. She was introduced during the latter half of 2003. She was introduced in episode 32. And claims that there is no such thing as equivalent exchange, despite the fact that she and Edward sort of have this whole spiel during this episode about equivalency. Edward and Dante do have a bit of a fight in this episode, but it's kind of rather short when Edward is transported beyond the gate. And sent into London during World War I. Again, yes, episode 49's just an awesome episode in my opinion. I just like how it just goes into the finale so well with the last 3 episodes. Number 2, episode 47, Sealing the Homunculus. Episode 47 is just a good episode in my opinion. So Edward confronts Sloth inside of a factory that Alphonse had managed to head towards, or that Alphonse had went to meet with Tucker. And Tucker was going to help Alphonse learn to use the Philosopher's Stone, which he plans to use to revive Nina. Oh yes, I forgot to talk about Chimera Tucker for a second. Yes, one thing I want to address, if you thought Nina was nightmare fuel when she turned into a Chimera, Chimera Tucker is worse. I definitely think he's a lot more disturbing looking than Chimera Nina was. I mean, just look at him. Anyway, Edward confronts Sloth and takes on Sloth, while also having to deal with Wrath. And yes, Lust fights off Wrath, is fighting against Wrath, while Edward takes on Sloth. And I love how he and Alphonse are talking about, should we kill her or should we not kill her? Edward is all for killing Sloth, but Al, on the other hand, saying, no, we can't kill her because she looks like Mom, even though she's not really their mother, but still takes on the appearance of their mother because of the fact that, yes, she was created from when Edward and Alphonse attempted to resurrect their mother at the very beginning of the series. So, yeah, this is a really good episode, and yet again, another great episode that challenges Edward's morality. Of course, Wrath is trying to protect Sloth because of the fact that he thinks Sloth is his own mother. And Wrath merges his body with Sloth's. However, Sloth is not able to move due to the fact that Sloth, or Wrath, had absorbed a piece of the piece of remains from Trisha's corpse, or from the thing that Edward used to bring back, or from Trisha's bones, from Trisha's remains. And yes, Edward decided to then finish off Wrath finish off Sloth, mind you, by turning her into ethanol. By turning her body into ethanol as she evaporates to death. This is a really good episode. The action was pretty heavy. I love the factory setting. It was a really good setting for this episode. But it's not my favorite. In fact, my favorite is coming up right now. And my number one favorite episode from Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is episode 34, Theory of Avarice. So, this adapts the Devil's Nest raid as the military is raiding the Devil's Nest. But in this version, it's not Bradley that leads the attack on the Devil's Nest. No, it's Frank Archer. Oh yes, and Kimberly steals the skull that Greed held onto. His skull from when he was a regular human being before he died. So yeah, Greed loses everything, nearly everything. His men get slaughtered. He is forced to. His possessions get slaughtered. I meant to say. He is forced to let Alphonse go, and we see Greed at his very lowest as a character, as he has nothing left. So he heads towards Dante's mansion, where he is then greeted by Edward. And yes, Greed is the first homunculus to actually die in this series. And his death is what leads Edward to find out the weakness of the homunculi. Anyway, Edward and Greed have one last fight within the mansion's foyer. And it's a really... Although the fight may be short, it's still really well paced. I loved how the animators got the fluidity of the movements in the fight. And definitely, I have to say it's my favorite episode of 2003. I gotta say, episode 34 to me was probably FMA 2003 at its peak. And don't get me wrong, it's still a very good series. Just it has a different way of telling the story of the Elric brothers in a much different manner than what Brotherhood is. Although I may be a Brotherhood fan, I still love 2003 for its flaws. And I gotta say, after rewatching it again, I've come to appreciate 2003. So anyway, this has been your Digital Super Saiyan 3, and I will see you guys next time. See ya!